Okay, thanks everyone for joining the webinar today. What can Gatsby plugins do? And we are glad that you're able to attend. A couple of announcements before we get started. The webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available on our website later today. It'll also be sent via email to all of the registrants. So if you miss a portion of the webinar, you'll get the recording later today. This is a 60-minute webinar, and we will leave time for questions at the end. But also there is the question chat window in the webinar user interface. So please feel free to submit your questions in that window as we go forward with the presentation. Everyone will be on mute during the webinar. So if you do need to chat or submit a question, you'll need to do it through that chat window. And with that, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, so this morning or afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world, we are focused on plugins and Gatsby plugins. We have three great speakers joining us today. The first is Jason Lengstorf, Head of Developer Relations at Gatsby, sometimes called Human Duct Tape because he has a variety of roles here. He's a regular keynote speaker and occasional bartender. We are also joined by Benedict Ray. And Benedict is an independent contractor working as a full stack developer. And she grew up with a developer mom, so she had free access to the internet from an early age. But it was actually her Norwegian teacher that introduced her to HTML in 1997. Since then, she has created countless apps, services, and sites, both for fun and profit. And the plugin Gatsby Remark O Embed is her first foray into open source. And last, we have Espen Hovlandstolt, is a full stack open sourcerer at Sanity.io with a particular fondness for React, JavaScript, and Node.js. And aside from programming, he enjoys taking his trusty sidekick miniature Schnauzer for long walks and is a no-shame coffee snob. So with that, I'm going to pass the controls over to Jason and we'll get started.
Okay.
Great, I can see your slides.
Cool. All right. Hello, everyone. I am Jason, and I'm going to talk about Gatsby plugins. So Linda already gave an overview of who I am, so I'll just skip through all this stuff and jump right into the Gatsby things. So Gatsby is a lot of things. It is a way to pull data from lots of different data sources and really normalize that so it's easy to work with. It's a way to build websites that are performant by default. It's a way to simplify the developer experience and use modern tools to build the plugins or to build the apps and websites that you want to build. But under the hood, Gatsby is effectively a collection of APIs. And those APIs allow us to do all of the things that Gatsby does. So for example, you're going to use an API called create pages, which is one of our Node APIs, to register a function that will create pages for you. And you'll create data using by hooking a function to the source nodes API. And we have a full list of APIs, which I'll just briefly pop open here so we can look at. We have APIs for a lot of things. So, we can create pages. We have a way to customize our GraphQL schema with create resolvers. You can update your Babel config or your Webpack config. You can update a node when it's created or, mess with a page once it's created. And all of these are just API hooks that allow you to do something when the Gatsby develop process or build process reaches this stage of the build. So make sure you check out that documentation for how those things work. Here's a really simplified example. If you wanted to create a page called My Page, you would use this would be in your node, your Gatsby Node.js. You would create a function that you would export as create pages, which Gatsby would then see when it looks at your Gatsby-node.js and execute. we get an object with actions in it. One of those actions is called create page, and we're able to pass in a path and the component we want to use. Now, there's more to it than this. You can also pass in context, and you can run GraphQL calls, and there's a lot that you can do, which we'll dig into in a little bit. But on its surface, this is an API that allows you to create a page. If you want to load data into Gatsby, if you want to add custom data, this is the source nodes API. And this is, again, a simplified example. But if you wanted to add in this data as a node that you could run queries against in Gatsby, you would hook a function to source nodes, and we're going to get back the actions object like before, but then we also get back a couple helpers to create a node ID and to create a content digest. And then we use the create node action. We put in the data, which is the name and the likes, and we create a node ID for it. We specify a type for the data, and then we create a content digest. And that puts this into the Gatsby data layer so that we can then query for that. And we can use these APIs to do all sorts of things. And you know, if you've ever looked at our source plugins, this is how we load data from third-party sources. All of them are going to be using source nodes, or most of them at least will be using source nodes in some capacity. We create pages from files. So when you put pages into the source pages directory of your Gatsby sites, we're actually using the create pages API under the hood to create those pages. We can convert data from one format to another, and this would be transformation. So if you wanted to take a JSON file or a YAML file and turn that into a GraphQL node that we can query against, you're going to use the onCreate node API to accomplish that. And so much more. There are, you know, close to 900 plugins right now in the Gatsby ecosystem, and those API, they all are using the APIs in various ways to do these sorts of things. But what's important to keep in mind is that all of these APIs are just what's available to a Gatsby site. So you've got the Gatsby Node APIs, and then we also have browser and SSR APIs that are allow you to do things during the browser render phase and the server-side rendering phase. In a lot of cases, this code that you're writing is reusable. So if you are doing something like creating a page for your website, that might not be shareable. You might be, you know, doing something that's extremely specific to your use case. But in many cases, the thing that you're doing is probably something that could be shared between multiple pages. And in a standard setup, you know, I can remember when I was working with like Jekyll, or when I had, you know, when I was working at my agency and we were doing web projects, we had these boilerplates, and it was just like collections of utility functions and all of these other things that would kind of add together to be quite a bit of boilerplate to allow us to set up a new project. But with Gatsby, we can roll this reusable logic up into plugins. So for example, if you are going to be using Markdown, converting Markdown to HTML that you can render on the page, that's something that's going to be generically true. For any website that uses Markdown, we always are going to need to convert that Markdown to a format that's displayable on the browser, which is HTML. If you wanted to add TypeScript support, like if you are a TypeScript shop and you want to write all of your sites in TypeScript, that setup of installing the Babel plugin and any Webpack configuration that you need, that is not specific to the site, that's specific to a workflow. And if you're in a TypeScript shop, that workflow is going to be true on any site that you build. If you want to load your posts from WordPress, WordPress's APIs are more or less consistent across installs. So you don't necessarily want to have to rewrite all of that code into source nodes for each site that you're building based on WordPress. So Gatsby plugins are shareable collections of code. We basically take these API calls and this different functionality, and we package them up into a package, an NPM package, or just a separate source of code that you're able to then install into a site and use. And so rather than going too deep into this, I figure we could just build a plugin because it'll make things a little bit clearer for me at least. And I hope that that seeing it done will clear things up for you as well. So what I've done is I have started up this simple site here, and I'm going to get it running So let's open up the terminal, and I'm just going to start it. So let's get the site running. Oops, let's see, NVM. I have an issue where my node versions are fighting with each other, so I have to always use the right version. So let's do yarn develop. And so this is going to start up Gatsby develop. And right now, apparently I have something else running on port 8000. Don't know what. Well, we'll figure that out. Instead, we're just going to use 8001. So here is the site. I don't need that window anymore. Okay, so this is just a really basic hello world example. And if we look at the code, we've got a source folder, a pages folder, and an index folder. That index folder is exporting this hello world div, and that's pretty much it. Our config is empty. All we're installing in here, we've got Gatsby React and React DOM. So, nothing up my sleeve. This is a brand new install with basically nothing set up in it. So let's go ahead and modify this. Let's build a plugin for it. So if we wanted to add some code, we could, for example, let's say we want to add a plugin, or let's start by just writing this code out. So if I go to Gatsby Node.js and I want to add information about my family to the Gatsby API layer, then we know that we're going to want to use source nodes. And source nodes is just a function. So by default, if I run this code, it's going to run, it's just not going to do anything. So instead, we want to figure out what we're going to do in here. And I have some data ready over on this other side here that I'm going to grab really quickly so that you don't have to watch me write out a JSON object. So let me add this data. And in here, we'll call this family.json. And I'm going to paste this in. And what this shows is we've got a name and then a relationship to family members by key. So this would be kind of, if you had a REST API, this might be the way that you would see the data, where everything is referenced by ID relationships. And that's all well and good, but the challenge with this would be, if I were to query for myself, I would then need to run a series of additional queries to get these family members, and that would be a pain. So in Gatsby, we want to make that easier. So I'm going to do that over here. I'm going to actually just set this up to read this data. So what I can do is I'm going to get this actions object, and then I'm also going to need to be able to create a node ID and create a content digest. And I'll talk a little bit about what those mean when we get there. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to load the family data, and we'll just get that in from the data folder. And then down here, I can say, let's just create nodes, and I'm going to loop through that by saying we're going to get the person. And for each person, I want to add their key. So we'll do a person.key. And then I'm going to do the name, which will be person.name. But for family, like if I just, actually, let's just look at this. So if I do family is person.family, then that's pretty much all I need. So now we have to do some required Gatsby fields. And this is so that Gatsby knows how to use the node. And these are, stop helping VS Code. We're going to add an ID. And so we have to figure out how to do that. We have to add some internal fields. And the internal fields that are required are a type and a content digest. So an ID is just something that needs to be unique. And there are a lot of ways that we could solve this problem, but the easiest one is to just use Gatsby's helper. So we're going to use create node ID. And then I'm going to pass in, we'll call this family, and then I'm going to use the person.key because that's going to be different for each person, even if they have the same name. For the type, I'm going to call it family. And this is arbitrary. It just needs to be unique. So in your instance, you would call this, whatever makes sense for your data, and just make sure that it's not the same as any other nodes in your data. For a content digest, what a content digest is a way for us to tell whether or not the node has changed. And so if you're not familiar with this, you can take data and then use encryption of some sort to basically get a hash of what the data is. So you're taking all the values and then you're running through a crypto function that will create, like, based on the data that's here, this is a hash of that data. And then if that data changes, you'll get a different hash, which means without having to compare all the fields, we can tell immediately that the data has changed. So that's what what Content Digest does. And rather than having to figure out how to write crypto, which isn't super hard, but is hard enough to not really be fun, we can just take this and run it against person. So anytime one of the people nodes changes, we're able to just say, hey, this node is different now. So having done that, we then have all of our node structures. So this is the actual node that we're returning. So it's got the data that's ours, the key, the name, and the family. And then it's got the data that we need to give Gatsby so that Gatsby knows what to do with it, the ID, and then the internal stuff, the type and the content digest. Once we have these, we need to actually create nodes. So I'm just going to set up a for each here, and we will say for each node, we're going to use actions, create node, and we'll just pass it in the node. When I run this, and since I've changed the node APIs, I'm going to have to stop and start. We can now go out and look at our GraphQL layer. And if I look in the docs, I can see in the query that we have a family and all family option. And here's the cool part. It's got this key, the name, and the family, which is everything that we wanted. So let's go in here and do all family. And that's going to give us nodes, and then we'll get the name and the family. Okay. And so this is good. We've got node data into our family, but we are definitely looking at node IDs instead of like useful information here. So what we need to do is figure out how to create these relationships. And so the way that we're going to do that is by, instead of using this person family here, I'm going to instead set this up as a node. And this is a kind of a Gatsby trick where if you have the data, we can say, I want this to refer to a different node. And then I can take the person.family and I can map through these IDs, get the key, and then I'm going to create a node ID using this key. So I can take this same value, but here instead of using person.key, I'm going to use the family key. And upon saving that, what I should be able to do is come out here once that finishes, okay? And if I refresh this, it's going to tell me that this is wrong because it needs a selection of subfields. And now I can set up that my family is resolving to the people that we need to resolve to. And here's what's really cool about this is it's recursive. Oops. So now I can say my family, and then Marissa has her family, and that'll come right back to me. And so we can keep going down this rabbit hole, but it gets a little ridiculous. But so this is a really powerful model because basically instead of having to get a bunch of IDs and then do the logic to figure this out, we are able to just say, I want to connect, the nodes to their IDs, and Gatsby's smart enough to figure out that relationship so that we can just query against it, which is a really powerful model. So now let's say that I've got a suite of sites and I need to use this code in multiple places. It turns out this is all pretty straightforward. So I can create, I'm going to do this locally. So I'm going to create a plugins folder, which Gatsby knows to look for. And then I'm going to create Gatsby source family. And the reason that we call it source is that it's sourcing nodes. It's a source of data. Once I have that, I'm going to move my data into it. I'm going to move my Gatsby node into it. And then we just need to create a package.json. And to avoid, actually, let me skip that. To avoid having to type out all of these fields by hand, I'm going to use a shortcut, and I'm going to do yarn init y. And what this will do is it just gives us the default fields. So to make sure that this plugin gets picked up, I need to add tags, I think, no, categories. And then we'll do Gatsby and Gatsby Plugin. And this is, if once we publish this, we want this to be available in the NPM package search. And I'm now doubting myself on this because I haven't done it in a while. So let me just do a quick search of the Gatsby plugins. We're going to take a look at just the source code. And this is a great way to learn how to do Gatsby plugins, is to look at plugins that are already built. And so what I'm looking for is the keywords, not categories. So I'm going to go back and switch this out, and we'll call it keywords. That's my fault. Okay, so we've got keywords. And then we also, now that we have this all set up, I'm going to change this to just resolve to Gatsby Node.js because we don't really need anything else. So then in here, now if we run this again, so if I just, or let me get back out. Okay, so I'm back in the root of this folder. I'm going to run yarn develop again. And as you might imagine, it doesn't work anymore. There is no query for all family. So we want to get that added back in. But because we've already packaged up this, this information, I can just set up my plugins array. And with Gatsby, you just specify any plugin that you want to use. And if you don't need any options for that plugin, you can drop in just the name of it. So I'm going to specify Gatsby source family. Let's stop and start. And once this gets up and running, what we should see here is that we're back. So now this site itself still doesn't have anything going on in it. There is no plugin, that plugin's not there. It's just installed through Gatsby config. And if we wanted to, then we could do something like import, let's see how we're doing on time, import GraphQL from Gatsby. And then I could do something like export const query is GraphQL. And then in here, I can just say all family nodes name. And then I can just list, actually for the sake of not watching me write code, let's just do a dump. And we'll say data. And what we should see now is if I go to the root of the site, we just have a list of all the family members. And so effectively now, without having written any code for the site, we just installed our source plugin. We're able to now access the data that was added by that source plugin. And if I, expand this out to be the name, then we'll see the family members get added, and we would have access to all of that inside of our repo. So with that being said, if you want to get started with plugins, we have a lot of things coming. I'm working on a plugin course now, so hopefully we'll have that out soon. But for now, you can take a look at our library of plugins. We're pushing 900, 884 as of today. We have plugins for everything. So if you want to do WordPress, we've got a Gatsby source WordPress. We've even got whatever this is, Gutenberg OSS generator, and ways to embed Mark or WordPress posts into Remark, and all sorts of fun things like that. We've got, let's see, like Shopify. We've got Sanity.io, which we'll hear about from Espen in a minute. We have all sorts of cool source plugins. We have transformer plugins that'll do image optimization and management. You can use MDX, which is a really exciting way to embed React components into your Markdown. All sorts of fun things are happening in the React ecosystem, or in the Gatsby plugin ecosystem. So if you are looking for something, there's a good chance that if you come to this page and search for it, it might already exist. If you find yourself in a position where it does not exist, you're able to write your own plugins, and you can do that by visiting our Creating Plugins docs. And that's going to kind of walk through how to name it, creating a local plugin, which is what we did today, and then talking through some of our basic concepts. What is a source plugin? What is a transformer plugin? How to make sure that it shows up in the plugin library, which is actually just what we did here. That's all you have to do to make it show up in the plugin library. We'll look for any packages that are tagged with those keywords. And then there are a couple here on building source plugins. So if you want to figure out how to make that work, how to do some of the more advanced things, we have that all documented out, and we're improving this all the time. So if you see something that you don't understand or that you want more information on, you can always send me something on Twitter, open an issue, reach out to us in some capacity, and let us know what you wish we had docs on, and we will add that to our list and try to get it taken care of for you. With that being said, that's all I got. So please post your questions. I will spend the rest of the webinar doing my best to answer those. I know that Kyle and Sam from the team have also been answering questions already. And I will now hand it back over to Linda.
Great. Thanks, Jason. As Jason mentioned, we've had a few questions come in already, so please continue to submit your questions in that question window, and we'll have Jason and the other moderators get to them. And with that, I'm turning it over to Benedict.
Remember to unmute. So my name is Benedicte, and as already told, I'm a full stack developer from Oslo, Norway. And the funny thing about this is that Espen, who's speaking after me, is also from Oslo, and his offices are like 10 minutes away from where I'm sitting right now. And I don't think the organizers actually realized that before today. So I have been coding professionally for almost 10 years, but this is so far my first and only NPM package. It's also my first and only open source project, and of course my first and only Gatsby plugin. So if you are an NPM publisher newbie like I was and still am, I will have some tips for you towards the end. And just as an intro, so far the whole experience has been a blast. Today, I will go through what I've made, why I made it, the journey of making it, and more technically how it's made, and then also my future plans for the plugin. So what does my plugin actually do? The plugin is named Gatsby Remark O-Embed, the most exciting name I could find. What it does, it embeds content in your Markdown. And by content, I mean Instagram posts, Vimeo and YouTube videos, SoundCloud tracks, and so much more, like Reddit threads, REPL projects, Code Sandbox projects, GIFs from Giphy, tweets, etc., etc. And the reason I can support all of these with one plugin is that I use the O-Embed protocol. So support for all of them comes courtesy of the O-Embed protocol. The O-Embed protocol consists of providers who expose endpoints where consumer can exchange a content URL for its embeddable HTML counterpart. The providers being the examples listed, such as YouTube, and the consumer, in this case, the plugin. And there you have the explanation for the name. I did not spell embed wrong. It is also a so-called sub-plugin. So Jason talked about how Markdown files can be transformed into the HTML you see on the page, and this plugin is a sub-plugin of the Gatsby Transformer Remark plugin. In the same way that, for instance, the Gatsby Remark Images plugin is. So it does not work on its own. It has to be set up as configured as a sub-plugin for the Gatsby Transformer Remark, as you can see in the code example in the slide. If you do not enable it, this is how it looks. Your results looks in the browser. And if you enable it, you get the actual tweet embedded. So why did I end up creating exactly this plugin? I think the process started around this time last year. I was looking into how I could embed tweets and Instagram posts into Gatsby blog generated from Markdown files. At the time, I was thinking about starting a blog yet again, and I've since realized that I am better at what I'm doing right now, talking rather than writing, so the blog is on definite hold. My older attempts at blogging have been using WordPress, and they have always included embeddable content like the ones I showed you. I still remember the amazement that I felt when I first pasted in a URL in a WordPress editor and the link turned into the embeddable counterpart. I had to figure out how it was done right away, and that is when I learned about the OEmbed protocol. And my little research shows me that OEmbed support was added to WordPress back in the end of 2009, so that's almost 10 years ago. Of ease that I wanted for myself and others using Gatsby, just paste in a link, not having to copy the whole embed HTML that you're also allowed to do when you try to embed a tweet, for instance. During my research, I found many plugins solving embedding content from singular or multiple providers using just the URL, but none of these plugins utilized the OEmbed protocol, so they couldn't generally support many providers. At the time, I was also looking for a way to get into open source, and I enjoyed playing with Gatsby, and I also really like the community surrounding Gatsby. So all of this combined became my reason for making the Gatsby Remark OEmbed plugin. So let's move into the journey. So a friend of mine created the initial proof of concept over the summer, and then I made the plugin ready for the world, and it was about to release when reports came in from one of my early users and testers, Amy Capers. Thank you, Amy. She was telling me it's not working anymore. I could not for the life of me figure out what was wrong, but I narrowed it down to the plugin not working specifically on release 2.0.18. Luckily for me, Gatsby were doing a pair programming outreach, and I hopped on a session with Michael and got it verified as a bug that was actually introduced in 2.0.18. Even though it was a bit of a bummer, I'm pretty happy I got the note before releasing the plugin. Had I released the plugin while the bug was still in Gatsby, I would probably had a lot of angry users telling me that my plugin was crap. So it was a long wait, but in January, the bug was fixed and my plugin was released. After that initial snafu, it's been a blast. I've had contributions from several continents, and I must give a big shout out to Ray Riffy, a developer from Thailand, who added some much needed functionality and also did a major reorganization of the code. So I was so happy I sent him a thank you package with Norwegian chocolate and an Easter card made by my 4-year-old daughter that you can see in the picture. And he then turned around and sent me some snacks and the Thai tea that I'm enjoying while I'm listening to the other speakers. Unfortunately, though, let's see. Yeah, unfortunately, though, for him, I didn't realize that not all countries are cold around Easter. So the chocolate was all melted, but a trip to the freezer seemed to fix it. The journey continued, and this week I've actually been hired to help a developer getting started with a similar plugin. So hopefully that's the beginning of something bigger for me. So how did I go about figuring out to make this plugin? Much in the same way that I usually do. It's a back and forth between looking at the documentation and looking at relevant code examples. The code examples in this case were existing plugins. I looked at Kyle Matthews' Twitter plugin to see how he solved getting tweets to behave, since they include JavaScript, while YouTube is just an iframe. I also looked at several of the Remark subplugins for inspirations about how to find the OEmbed URLs in the Markdown AST or abstract syntax tree format. I learned just enough to make it work, but I wouldn't say any more than that. On a basic level, this is what the plugin does. It fetches the list of OEmbed providers from oembed.com. And then for every markdown file, it looks for OEmbed URLs, and then it sends a request to the correct provider for each URL and swap it out with the HTML returned by the provider. In addition, some magic is needed to make Twitter, Instagram, Flickr, and Reddit work. So step one, I fetch the providers on the pre-bootstrap, so it's only done once. And to be able to retrieve it later, when I go through all the markdown files, I save it to the cache. This is where the bug, I had the problems with the Gatsby bug, and also one of the things I found really hard to figure out when I started working on this plugin. In the beginning, I fetched the OEmbed provider list in this step, and very quickly ran out of memory because then it was done on every markdown file. So it worked for 2 files, but not when it went for people with 100 blog posts, for instance. In step 2, I go through every markdown file. I find the possible OEmbed URL markdown nodes from the syntax tree, and then I process each, swapping the URL node for the HTML returned. So this is approximations of the code. I've taken out all of the tries and error reporting and stuff like that. And then over to the magical step three part. The approach so far works for most embeds, but not Twitter, Instagram, Flickr, and Reddit. Their HTML includes a JavaScript tag, and JavaScript inside JSX is not executed, and this makes the embeds looks weird. Therefore, I have to add these scripts, and I do that on the render or on render body, and it's added, as you can see in set post body components. I add all the script tags, and this is all done in the server-side rendering step of the Gatsby build. And for Twitter and Instagram, I have to do some even more magic because they depend on document load events, and there are no document load events when the Gatsby side is hydrated in the browser. So here, to help with that, we manually call Twitter and Instagram to go through the content again on every en route update. Probably not totally clear, but go look at the source code if you like, and I can answer any questions you might have. So one of the things I feared going into the process of creating a plugin was that final step of packaging and releasing the plugin on NPM, and also getting it into the Gatsby plugin library. I also seen on Twitter somebody responded to me that that was one of the things they were a little unsure about, and luckily, I can tell you that this turned out to be much easier than I thought. The NPM documentation is quite overwhelming, so I ended up Googling it, but in the end, it boils down to creating an account with NPM and then log in through the terminal and then do an NPM release every time you have a new release. And that's it. I did find the Gatsby documentation helpful with how to get it found in the plugin library that Jason covered. For development, I just added my plugin repo as a local plugin to a dev site I created. And I know there are a lot fancier ways of doing this, but it has worked out fine, and it's probably a very easy way for you to get started. What I did find challenging, though, was the testing stage. How do one test a plugin before it's shipped as an NPM package? It turns out that you can install packages straight from a GitHub repo. You can even target, tag, or a branch. So that's what I asked and still ask people to do before I release new versions to NPM. So what does the future hold for the Gatsby Remark OEmbed plugin? First, and a big issue is trying to get the plugin and Gatsby MDX that Jason mentioned to work nicely together. I've looked at it before, and last night this issue came in. Somebody tried to do it, so that makes me more motivated to look into that. I don't know if the issue is on my end or their end, and I think it might have to do with that caching, the same problem that we had in October with the Gatsby Transformer Remark plugin. Another thing I would like is to make the plugin a place where code newbies are welcome. So I've started tagging some of our issues with good first issues, and I will be happy to help you through making your first submit to our repository. And last but not least, I hope to continue making plugins, both open source and as a contractor. I already have several ideas for new open source plugins. That's all I have for today. So let's be interwebs, friends. I am at Ray on Twitter and GitHub, and I'm at Ray Codes on Instagram. And I hope to see you there.
Great, thanks so much, Benedict. We've had a few questions come in during your presentation, and I know the moderators are working to get them answered. So please keep your questions coming. And I'm going to then pass the controls over to our next presenter. Espen, you should be able to share your screen now. And you're still on mute, I believe.
Yes, I am. Hello. So I'm Espen. As I was introduced, I work at Sanity.io, lucky enough to be doing a whole lot of really cool stuff, much of which is open source. And for those of you who don't really know about Sanity, I'm just going to quickly explain what it is. So we're a platform for structured content. So we kind of host your data for you, and we provide you with APIs for querying and altering that data, all that kind of good stuff. But in addition to that, you get like a real-time collaborative content management system, which you can then customize to your needs. So that's not a sales pitch. It's actually some background for explaining some of the interesting challenges and opportunities we have when we made our Gatsby plugin. So I want to start by just saying a quick few words about how I started learning Gatsby. I'm the kind of developer that kind of rejects all documentation and just goes straight to the source code. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that in this case, because there's a lot of concepts that were foreign to me when I started, and if I just spent some time in the documentation or just heard maybe this plugin webinar with what Jason explained, I'd be much more understanding of what the different APIs are for and what the different concepts inside of Gatsby are. Anyway, as Jason said earlier, source plugins are responsible for pulling data from a source and then creating these source nodes or nodes inside of Gatsby. So that's what we wanted to do for Sanity, so you could pull all your data from Sanity into a Gatsby site. And with a lot of different sources, you have this kind of very uniform data model. So if you think about how Instagram images are modeled, they usually have the same shape, they have the same properties. Medium posts also has this pretty much the same properties. It's just the content that differs. RSS feeds is another good example of a very structured model where all the fields are usually the same. But inside of a Sanity project, it's up to the user, that will be you, to actually define how your data model looks. So you could model anything basically, from blog posts to employees for your company, opening hours or even Lego sketches. Anything that you can think of can be modeled as data. As long as you can represent it as JSON, we can store it inside of Sanity. And this provides us with a few challenges. So one of these are that by default, Gatsby will try to introspect that data. It basically looks at your data and tries to then figure out, okay, you added a title field, which is always a string, so we can assume that this is going to be a string inside of the GraphQL schema. And this works in a lot of these cases where you have uniform data models, but if you have a very complex, nested, deeply structured model, then it might not work as well. Nor does this actually work before you actually have data that Gatsby can look at. So if you don't have a particular field within your data at the time you build the site, then you won't be able to query for that field. And so when we started writing this plugin, we solved this by defining a GraphQL schema. Basically, we looked at the schema that you defined in your Sanity project and then allowed you to deploy that as a GraphQL schema. And then we would be able to then pull that GraphQL schema in the GraphQL schema definition language, or SDL as it's called. And then based on that, we could generate a series of example data nodes. So that's what I call a festival of hacks. It wasn't really much fun trying to figure that out. But in the end, we managed to get something that worked for 70% of the cases, I would say. Luckily, in Gatsby 2.2, we got some really awesome new APIs that allowed us to fix most of these issues. So I'm just going to go through some of these because I think they're the most fun and interesting new concepts of Gatsby lately. So the first one is the Create Types API. And this allows you to pretty basically define a GraphQL schema for your data. And you do this by using the GraphQL schema definition language, which is really nice for us because that's what we already pulled down from Sanity. And the GraphQL toolkit that you can install just by using the GraphQL package from NPM actually has a lot of helpers that allows you to parse the GraphQL schema definition language into an abstract syntax tree. And with that syntax tree, we can iterate through it and modify it to our needs. So in the case of the Gatsby plugin, we make sure that all the types are prefixed with something that makes it unique. So for instance, we prefix by default to Sanity. So if you have an author type, that won't collide with some other plugins author type. And this is really like the main thing that took us 90% of the way, because we could tell Gatsby exactly what fields existed, what they were returning, and it just made the whole the data model much more predictable. This is how the API looks. It's like a simplified example. So you pass it a string, which then holds the schema definition language. And as you can see here, I've defined a type called author, which implements node, which is what the Gatsby node is called. And then you give it the fields that you want it to have. In the case of the exclamation mark on the end of the string there, that just means it's required. It won't be. It's not non-null field, so it can't be left out of the model. And the other API that allowed us to get the remaining 10% of the way is the Create Resolvers API. And this allows us to be very explicit on how we want to actually resolve our data, which allows us to move some logic from the sourcing step. Like when you pull the data, we usually transform the data as close to what Gatsby was expecting as possible. But now we can actually move some of this logic into the resolver step, which is really extremely valuable because it allows us to do things like resolve references inside arrays. Sanity has this concept of being able to have polymorphic fields, which means it can a field can be one or more different types. And this doesn't really work well with out of the box with Gatsby, because it didn't understand the different types that it could be. And in some cases, you could embed either an inline object or an inline type, or you could have a reference inside of that array, which wasn't possible to express in before this API came along. But now we're able to actually say, I want to iterate through the array for that field, and I want to check, is it a reference? And if so, I'll use the Gatsby getNodeById method to actually resolve that to a Gatsby node. And if not, I'll just return the item as is. This is just one of the things you can do. You can also do things like return raw JSON for a field. So in the case of this body field, potentially it might be hard to query for all the different variations to get all the fields that you want. And so we can sort of provide an escape hash by just adding another field, let's say raw body, and then say that the type should be JSON, and then provide a resolver that fetches the data from the body field. So it allows us to do all that kind of good stuff, and is really extremely flexible. And the fun thing about this is that I feel like Gatsby is finally like unleashing the potential of GraphQL, because now it's in line with the rest of the GraphQL ecosystem, and it makes all the schemas that it provides very predictable and flexible, and they're very easy to work with, both as a plugin author, but also as a consumer. When you query for a field, you know that it's a certain type. You can use the graphical interface that Jason showed earlier when he was writing these queries to actually introspect and see the different types that it's going to return. It's a very nice experience. There's some other things which might not seem as interesting on the surface. The create node API, which was used earlier to actually get nodes into the system, has a lot of hidden potential. So I want to highlight some of that. One of the things that I found really interesting is that Gatsby is actually quite a good generic like data fetching framework. If you think about it, it's made this ecosystem of all these source plugins that define a way to pull data into a fairly standard or normalized way of thinking about the data, which is quite powerful. But on top of that, it also allows one of the most underrated features of Gatsby. So it's the quick feedback loop. So if you think about how when you set up a Gatsby site, if you change a React component, it like automatically, instantly hot reloads, and you can see the changes in real time. But I discovered while developing our plugin that if you actually call this create node with the same node ID that you have previously added, in development mode, it'll actually live reload the data as well. So this gave me an idea to sort of hook up the listener API, which we have in Sanity, which allows us to push data to instead of having the source plugin request new data. So I want to show how this works just quickly by a little demo here, which I recorded when I made it. So as you can see, on the right here is the Sanity Studio. And when I change this content, the Gatsby frontend on the left here, just live in real time, reflects this. And this isn't just running locally, this is actually persisting the changes to the cloud and pushing the changes down to me. So you can even connect other people to the same front end potentially, and if you're running this in development mode at least, and you can see the changes in real time. So it's really cool and really powerful abstraction, I think. As you can see, once I add a slug here in a bit, it'll start populating. That little flicker was when Gatsby actually built a new page. And once you actually fill in some data, you can see that when I click the read article here, it'll actually start showing the content in real time as well. So that's just a quick demo of what it allows you to do. It also allows us to integrate with Gatsby Preview, which works using the same APIs. So if you want this kind of developer experience and this kind of experience for your editors as well, then you can use the new Gatsby Preview to show this to your editors and have them see the content changes in real time. You can also see Kyle Matthews did a talk in Gatsby Days in New York, where we demoed this using the actual Gatsby Preview stuff. So if you're interested in seeing that in action, then go check that talk out. It's on YouTube. Yeah, that's really all I had. I'm obviously open to answering any questions.
Great, thanks, Espen. As we see if there's any last questions that come through, just a quick reminder that to get started with plugins, please go to gatsbyjs.org/plugins. You can continue to learn more there. You can search for plugins and learn how to submit your own and build and submit your own plugin. So that's where you can get started. Now, as we're ending, we just have a minute or two left. I would love to know what types of plugins people are most interested in. So if you have a minute and can put that in the chat window, I'd love to hear more about what plugins either you've used before or are interested in using, finding, or building yourself. I think that's always interesting to see. And Jason, were there any questions you saw come through during the presentations that you wanted to call out?
I mean, it looked like people had questions about doing asynchronous things with plugins, and so it's probably worth noting that plugins run at build time. So if there are things that you need to do with a plugin that happen when the client loads the page, you can package up some functionality into a plugin. You know, you could always have some boilerplate laid to say get the initial data and then provide some helpers so that you could load data asynchronously when somebody loads the page. But plugins don't run on the client side. They only run during the build phase. So anything that happens during the client load would be handled kind of in that would be handled in userland. You would need to provide code for that. Just what in, you know, like I said, you could provide utilities to do that for you if you needed to. And then the other question that I saw that I thought was good was about whether or not the Create Pages API is putting things into an SPA or a single page app. The way that Gatsby works is we build out each route as a static file so that if you have JavaScript disabled and you navigate directly to a page by URL, it's going to load and it's going to work. You can see the content, you can continue to use the page and navigate around. But if you have JavaScript enabled, what will happen is we will remount a React app, and that React app is a single page app. We'll use Reach Router under the hood so that we load between pages and it feels instantaneous. Because you're not doing a full page refresh, you're just loading the new data, which we're actually loading in the background. So we prefetch those routes when we're using the single page app. So basically, when you use Create Page, you are creating new routes that can be loaded as static files. But in the context of Gatsby, when JavaScript is enabled, it works as if it were a single page app.
Great. Thanks, Jason, for clarifying. Well, we are out of time now, so thanks again, everyone, for joining. The recording of the webinar will be available on our website later today. It'll also be sent to everybody via email who registered. So if you missed anything or want to catch any of the details, you can do that on the recording shortly or later today. So thanks, everyone, for joining, and we'll see you next time.